I still remember the exact moment the billionaire looked me in the eyes and said, "Stay away from her." Not shouted, not whispered, calm, controlled. The kind of warning that doesn't sound like a threat because it doesn't need to. The kind that tells you this isn't the first time something went wrong, and it won't be the last. At the time, I was just the chauffeur's son. That's how everyone saw me. That's how I saw myself. I wasn't supposed to be part of the story. I wasn't supposed to notice anything. I was supposed to open doors, keep my head down, and disappear into the background of a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. But when someone that powerful tells you to stay away from one person in particular, your brain does something strange. It doesn't listen. It zooms in. Because warnings don't exist to protect you. They exist to protect secrets. I didn't grow up around billionaires. I grew up around people who worked double shifts, who learned early that silence keeps you employed and curiosity gets you fired. My father drove executives, investors, politicians. He taught me two rules: never ask questions and never assume you know the full story. So when I took the temporary job helping him during a busy season, I followed those rules. I memorized schedules. I learned which doors never opened. I learned which floors had cameras and which didn't. And I learned that there was one wing of the house everyone avoided. That was where she lived, the billionaire's stepdaughter. No one said her name unless they had to. Staff rotated constantly. Nannies never lasted. Assistants requested reassignment. Even family friends joked about her like she was a myth, not a person. Difficult, unstable, impossible. Those were the words I heard over and over again, but no one ever said why. The first time I saw her, it wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no tantrum. She was sitting alone on the back staircase, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the floor like it had personally betrayed her. She looked younger than I expected, quieter, smaller. She looked nothing like the monster everyone described. I didn't stop. I wasn't supposed to. And I would have kept walking if she hadn't spoken. "You don't belong here." Not angry, not rude, just factual. I told her I was helping my dad, that I'd be gone soon, that I wasn't part of the house. She looked up at me then, really looked, and for half a second something crossed her face. Recognition, fear, relief. I still don't know which. That's when I understood something no one had said out loud. She wasn't pushing people away. She was waiting for someone to notice. After that, I tried to stay away. I really did. Because a billionaire doesn't warn you twice. And because I'd seen what happened to people who ignored boundaries in places like this. They didn't get fired loudly. They just vanished from the schedule. But patterns started showing up once I started paying attention. Every nanny who quit did so after a private meeting with the same family lawyer. Every incident involving her somehow never made it to HR. Security footage near her wing was always under maintenance, and the stepmother, always perfectly composed, never once visited her. Not once. The night everything changed, my father was running late, storm outside, power flickering. The kind of night where rich houses suddenly feel fragile. I was sent upstairs to deliver documents. Wrong place, wrong time. I heard raised voices behind a closed door. The stepmother's voice was sharp, controlled anger, the kind practiced over years. "You don't understand what would happen if this got out." And then the girl's voice, shaking, but not weak. "I understand exactly what would happen. That's why you're scared. I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed." That conversation rewired how I saw everything, because what they weren't talking about was behavior. They were talking about ownership, about money tied to guardianship, about trusts that activated under conditions no one else knew about a document signed years ago after her biological mother died that transferred control of something massive not to the billionaire, but to her. Conditional control. Control that disappeared if she was deemed unstable. Control that vanished if she couldn't function without supervision. That's when the warning made sense. Stay away from her wasn't about protection. It was about isolation. From that point on, every interaction felt different. Every outburst she was blamed for suddenly looked staged, every report exaggerated, every meltdown timed perfectly before legal evaluations. She wasn't impossible. She was inconvenient. and the people around her were manufacturing a narrative. The problem was, once you see that, you can't unsee it. I started noticing how often she was medicated right before meetings, how her schedule changed whenever outside doctors were involved, how she was praised in private and undermined in public. I noticed how she flinched when certain topics came up, how she asked me questions no one else ever answered honestly, how she already knew the ending of a story she wasn't allowed to tell. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This family wasn't broken. It was engineered. And I was standing in the middle of it, whether I wanted to be or not. I wasn't a hero. I didn't storm in with evidence. I didn't confront anyone dramatically. That's not how real secrets unravel. They unravel quietly, through timing, through listening, through being underestimated. They underestimated me because of my last name. They underestimated her because of her reputation. And together, that made us dangerous. I realized the family secret wasn't just about money or control. It was about rewriting reality, convincing the world that the wrong person was the problem. And once I understood that, I had a choice. Do exactly what the billionaire told me to do, or ignore him and find out how deep this really went. I chose the second option. And that decision didn't just change her life. It changed mine. Because the moment you uncover a family secret like this, you stop being invisible. And invisibility was the only thing keeping me safe. The next morning, the house felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just tighter. Like everyone knew something had shifted but didn't know where the crack was yet. That's the thing about secrets in powerful families. They don't explode, they suffocate. I started noticing eyes on me. Staff who never acknowledged me before suddenly knew my name. Security lingered a second too long. The billionaire's assistant asked questions that sounded casual but weren't, and she stopped pretending I didn't exist. She started finding reasons to cross my path, asking for help with things she didn't need help with, sitting in rooms she knew I'd pass through, testing not me but the space around us, testing how much control she actually had. One afternoon, she handed me a notebook. No explanation, no build-up. Just placed it in my hands and said, "If anything happens to me, this matters." Inside were dates, times, names, medical dosages, conversations summarized in a handwriting that was too neat for someone everyone called unstable. There were copies of emails she'd printed years ago, photos of documents taken late at night, notes about meetings she wasn't supposed to understand but clearly did. This wasn't paranoia. This was documentation. That's when it hit me how long she'd been doing this alone. How many times she'd tried to signal that she wasn't the problem, only to be dismissed because the narrative was already written. In the US, we love the idea that money buys freedom, but what it really buys is control over the story, over who gets believed, over who gets labeled. And she had been labeled early. I asked her why she trusted me. She said, "Because you weren't supposed to notice, and you did." That night, the billionaire called me into his office. Same calm voice. Same controlled posture, but now there was something underneath it. Calculation. He didn't mention her at first. He talked about loyalty, about opportunity, about how families like his take care of people who know their place. Then he leaned back and said, "You're getting close to something that doesn't concern you." I told him I wasn't looking for anything. He smiled. That's usually how it starts. He didn't threaten me. He didn't need to. He talked about my father, his age, his health, his job security, about how easy it is for lives to get complicated when lines blur. That was the moment I understood the real power dynamic. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what she had already built. Because the notebook wasn't the secret. It was proof that the secret could survive without me. After that, things escalated fast. A new therapist was brought in. Her medication was adjusted without explanation. She was scheduled for an evaluation that would determine whether she remained legally competent. That evaluation would decide everything. If she failed, control shifted permanently. If she passed, the entire structure collapsed. I watched how they prepared her for failure, how they framed questions, how they pushed emotional buttons, how they created conditions where reacting normally would be used against her. This wasn't care. It was strategy. I started helping her prepare, quietly. Not telling her what to say, but helping her understand the game, how certain words trigger assumptions, How silence can be safer than honesty in the wrong room. How in America, perception often outweighs truth. She learned fast. Because she'd been training for this her whole life without knowing it. The day of the evaluation, the house was full. Lawyers, doctors, advisors, people who smiled too easily, people who never introduced themselves. She walked in calm, centered, different, and for the first time, I saw fear in the stepmother's eyes. Not because she might lose control, but because the story might change. During the evaluation, something unexpected happened. One of the doctors asked a question that wasn't on the approved list. A question about consent, about past decisions, about who benefited. And she answered without hesitation, with clarity, with dates, with references. The room shifted. You could feel it. That's when I realized the family secret wasn't just exposed, it was contagious. Once one person started questioning the narrative, others followed. Side conversations stopped. Notes were rewritten. The tone changed. By the end of the day, no one looked relieved. They looked uncertain. Uncertainty is dangerous for people who rely on control. That evening, she asked me if it was over. I told her the truth. No. But it's different now. Because once doubt enters a system built on silence, it never really leaves. And once you help someone reclaim their voice, you can't pretend you didn't hear it. I went home that night knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't step back from. The billionaire didn't call again. That was worse. Because silence in places like this means something is being rearranged. And whatever came next would test whether uncovering the family secret was enough or whether surviving it would cost us everything. The days that followed were unnervingly polite. No confrontations, no raised voices, just a sudden professionalism layered over everything, like a corporate rebrand after a scandal no one is allowed to name. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Phone calls stopped when I entered a room. My father was reassigned routes without explanation. Small moves, but deliberate ones. That's how pressure works at that level. It doesn't crush you, it isolates you. She noticed it too. The way staff interacted with her shifted. Less dismissive, more cautious. Not respect yet, but hesitation. And hesitation is progress when you're fighting a narrative that's been weaponized against you. One night, she asked me something I hadn't expected. What happens if I win? Not legally, not financially, personally. I didn't have a clean answer. Because in families like this, winning doesn't mean freedom. It means exposure. It means retaliation disguised as concern. It means being watched more closely, not less. I told her that winning would mean choices, real ones, and that scared her more than losing ever had. The stepmother made her move a week later. A controlled leak. Not to the press, but to the right people. Old stories resurfaced, selective memories, anonymous concerns about her stability. Nothing provable. Just enough noise to muddy the water. That's when I understood how fragile truth is when it competes with money. I didn't counter it directly. You can't fight whispers with facts. You fight them with timing. I helped her prepare something she'd never done before. She told her story herself. Not emotionally, not defensively. Calm, structured, clear. She didn't accuse. She explained. She didn't dramatize. She documented. She spoke to the people who mattered before the rumors reached them. Advisors, trustees, individuals who didn't care about family drama but cared deeply about liability. And suddenly, the conversation shifted again. Because once risk enters the equation, loyalty disappears. The billionaire finally confronted me in person after that. Not in his office, in the garage, neutral ground. He asked me what I wanted. Money, silence, a future. I told him I already had a future. I just didn't want it built on pretending I hadn't seen what I saw. He studied me for a long time. Then he said something I didn't expect. She was never supposed to understand. That sentence explained everything. She wasn't meant to be unstable. She was meant to be dependent. Forever young, forever confused, forever managed. And she had outgrown the role. From that moment on, the power dynamic changed completely. Not because he lost control overnight, but because he realized control was no longer guaranteed. And people like him don't fear loss. They fear uncertainty. She began reclaiming parts of her life quietly, choosing her schedule, changing doctors, requesting independent audits. Each move small on its own, but together impossible to ignore. I stayed close, but not visible. That was the agreement. She didn't need a savior. She needed space to prove she'd never been the problem. My father eventually asked me why things felt tense. I told him the truth, in pieces. Enough for him to understand the risk. Not enough to endanger him. He nodded and said something that stuck with me. Power hates witnesses, and by then I had become one. The family secret was no longer just a secret. It was leverage. And leverage changes how everyone behaves. What I didn't know yet was how far they were willing to go to get it back. What surprised me most was how normal everything tried to look afterward. The dinners still happened at the same time. The staff still moved with rehearsed precision. The house still smelled like expensive wood polish and money that never worried about tomorrow. But underneath all of it, something fundamental had shifted. The illusion of inevitability was gone. When power assumes it's permanent, it gets lazy. And once it realizes it might not be, it becomes unpredictable. I started keeping my own notes then. Not because I planned to expose anything publicly, but because memory is fragile when pressure is constant. Dates, conversations, changes in tone. Who stopped returning calls? Who suddenly became overly friendly? I learned quickly that in environments like this, friendliness is often a warning sign. She was changing too. Not in the dramatic way people expect. No sudden confidence montage, no speeches, just subtle adjustments. She slept better, ate more regularly, asked fewer questions that were traps and more that were strategic. She stopped trying to convince people she was sane and focused instead on being consistent. Consistency terrifies manipulators because it leaves no room for reinterpretation. One afternoon, she asked me to walk with her around the perimeter of the property. It was something she'd never done alone. Security usually discouraged it. Too exposed, they said. Too unpredictable. As we walked, she told me about her mother. Not the polished version the family shared, but the real one. The woman who kept journals, who questioned contracts, who didn't trust smiles without paperwork.
She used to tell me that control doesn't come from strength, she said. It comes from patience. That's when I realized where she'd learned all this. Her mother hadn't just left her money. She'd left her instructions. The family secret wasn't improvised. It was inherited. Passed down quietly like a contingency plan. A reminder that someone, somewhere, had seen this coming. That realization changed how I saw everything that followed.
The legal pressure increased, but so did the scrutiny on the family. Audits expanded. Third-party reviews appeared. Advisors began asking questions that weren't part of the script. And suddenly, the stepmother's certainty started cracking. She became sharper, less controlled. She interrupted meetings, corrected people unnecessarily. The mask slipped just enough for others to notice. That's the paradox of long-term manipulation. It only works as long as everyone plays their role. Once one person steps out of character, the entire performance looks suspicious. The billionaire stayed mostly silent during this phase. Observing, calculating. He wasn't emotional about it. He treated it like a hostile takeover, which in a way, it was. Except the company was his family. I started receiving offers then. Not directly, but through intermediaries. Suggestions, opportunities elsewhere, scholarships, jobs that didn't exist before, but suddenly had my name attached to them. They weren't bribes. They were exits. He wanted me gone without making it obvious. I declined all of them. Not out of bravery, out of understanding. Leaving would have confirmed everything they hoped was true. That I was temporary. That the problem would resolve itself once the distraction disappeared. I wasn't the distraction. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for. She faced another evaluation shortly after. This one more subtle. Framed as support. Wellness. Optimization. All the right words. But by then, she knew how to listen between the lines. She passed again. And this time, no one could explain it away. That's when alliances shifted. People who'd stayed neutral began choosing sides, not out of morality, but self-preservation. Because if she won, Anyone who'd supported the wrong version of reality would suddenly look complicit. I watched loyalty evaporate in real time. The stepmother started making mistakes, small ones, overplaying her hand, pushing too hard. She tried to rush a decision that couldn't be rushed anymore. The billionaire finally called a family meeting. Everyone present, no lawyers, no assistants, just blood and contracts pretending to be blood. He spoke first, calm, measured. He framed it as concern, as exhaustion, as a desire for peace. Then she spoke. Not emotionally, not defensively. She laid out a timeline. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She didn't need to. She let the facts sit in the room and do what facts always do when they're no longer suppressed. They rearranged the air. When she finished, no one spoke for a long time. The billionaire didn't deny anything. He just said, "You've changed." And she replied, "I was never allowed to be." That sentence landed harder than any accusation ever could, because it reframed everything. This wasn't rebellion, it was correction. After that meeting, nothing was officially resolved. That's not how things end in places like this. There was no confession, no apology, just a slow redistribution of power. Control loosened, oversight increased, distance replaced dominance. And the family secret stopped being a weapon and became a liability. I thought that would be the end of my role. I was wrong. Because once you help someone step out of a cage they were born into, you don't just walk away unchanged. You start seeing cages everywhere. In institutions, in narratives, in systems designed to reward compliance over clarity. And the most dangerous realization of all came quietly, late one night, as I reviewed my notes. This wasn't unique. This wasn't rare. This was just one version of a pattern that repeats wherever power goes unquestioned, and silence is mistaken for stability. The billionaire had warned me to stay away from her. What he hadn't realized was that by doing so, he'd drawn a line around the truth. And once I crossed it, there was no going back. After that realization, I stopped thinking of myself as someone caught in the middle. There was no middle anymore. There was before, when the story belonged to them, and after, when it didn't. The change showed up in small, almost invisible ways. Invitations stopped arriving for the stepmother. Advisors began requesting meetings directly with her instead of through intermediaries. Documents that used to be signed without discussion suddenly came with questions attached. The system wasn't collapsing, but it was hesitating, and hesitation is lethal to control structures. She noticed it too. Not with relief, but with caution. People assume that once you expose the truth, everything feels lighter. It doesn't. It feels unstable. Because the lies, as harmful as they were, had at least been predictable. Freedom introduces uncertainty. One night we sat in the kitchen long after the staff had cleared out. She asked me if I thought they'd ever admit what they'd done. I told her the truth. No. They'll reframe it. They'll say it was complicated. That intentions were misunderstood. That no one is really to blame. She nodded like she already knew. Then I don't need them to admit it, she said. I just need them to stop deciding who I am. That was the moment I understood her real goal. It wasn't revenge. It was authorship. The next phase was quieter, but more dangerous. When power realizes it's losing, it doesn't attack directly. It waits for mistakes, for fatigue, for isolation to do the work it no longer can. I felt it personally then. Friends I'd made among the staff began distancing themselves, not coldly, carefully, like they were protecting something fragile. I couldn't blame them. Association has consequences when hierarchy is involved. My father was offered early retirement. Generous, polite, irrevocable. He came home confused, trying to read between lines that weren't meant for him. I told him enough to explain the timing, not enough to make him afraid. He listened quietly and said he was proud of me in a way that felt heavier than any warning. I realized then that there was a cost to continuing, and that cost wouldn't be paid all at once. It would be paid slowly, in pieces. She began meeting with people outside the family's orbit, independent advisors, specialists with no history tied to the estate. Each meeting expanded her world and shrank the one that had once contained her. The stepmother responded by tightening what control she still had. Passive resistance, delays, bureaucracy disguised as concern. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was stalling. That's when the unexpected happened. A journalist reached out, not to me, to her, not with accusations, but with curiosity. Someone had noticed inconsistencies, patterns, gaps in public records that didn't line up with the family's polished image. The journalist wasn't aggressive, just persistent. She showed me the email and asked what I thought. I told her that stories don't break because someone wants justice. They break because timing aligns with credibility. And credibility for the first time was on her side. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she prepared. She organized everything her mother had left behind, cross-referenced it with her own records, cleaned timelines, removed emotion. What remained was undeniable. Still, she hesitated. Not because she was scared of them, because she was scared of what public truth does to private wounds. In America, exposure isn't gentle. It doesn't care about nuance. It doesn't pause for healing. It turns lives into content and calls it accountability. She asked me if I thought it was worth it. I told her I couldn't answer that for her, that once the story belonged to the public, it would never belong to her again in the same way. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said something I'll never forget. They already took my silence. I won't give them my voice too. That's when I knew the secret was no longer just uncovered. It was about to move. The family sensed it before it happened. Pressure increased. Conversations became urgent. The billionaire finally broke his silence and asked to meet her alone. She agreed, but only under conditions. Observers present, notes recorded. No ambiguity. That meeting lasted hours. When she came out, she looked exhausted, but steady. She didn't tell me what was said. She didn't need to. The next day, the trust structure was amended. Not rewritten, adjusted. Enough to change everything. The stepmother left the house shortly after. Not dramatically. No confrontation. Just absence where presence used to dominate. Power doesn't always fall. Sometimes it retreats to preserve what's left. People started asking me what would happen next. I didn't have an answer. Because the truth is, uncovering the family secret didn't end the story. It shifted its center. And once that happens, everyone involved has to decide who they are without the roles they were given, including me. Because I was no longer just the chauffeur's son, and I was no longer invisible, which meant whatever came next would require a different kind of courage. The kind that doesn't come from reacting to power, but from standing still when it finally starts paying attention. When power finally pays attention to you, it doesn't announce itself. It watches. It measures. It waits to see whether you'll flinch. That was the phase we entered next. The house became quieter, not because fewer people were there, but because everyone was listening. Every movement felt recorded, even when no cameras were obvious. Every decision carried weight, even trivial ones. That's what happens when a system realizes it can't rely on routine anymore. She handled it better than I did. She had spent years being watched without being believed. I was new to that feeling. New to knowing that a single misstep could be interpreted, reframed, and weaponized. I caught myself overthinking conversations, rereading messages, rehearsing explanations for questions that hadn't been asked yet. She noticed and told me something that recalibrated everything. They need you tense, she said. That's how they pull mistakes out of people. So I stopped trying to be careful. I became consistent instead. Consistency is boring to predators. It gives them nothing to grab onto. I showed up when expected, left when appropriate, said less, observed more. I stopped reacting to pressure and started letting it pass through without resistance. That unnerved them more than defiance ever could. The billionaire, especially. He began testing boundaries indirectly. Casual comments meant to provoke. Hypothetical questions framed as mentorship. He wanted to see if I'd overplay my hand now that the balance had shifted. I didn't. Because I wasn't there to win against him. I was there to make sure she didn't lose herself again. What most people don't understand is that once you step into the truth, you don't feel brave. You feel exposed. The lies that once insulated you are gone, and all that's left is clarity. Clarity is cold. It doesn't comfort you. It just shows you where you stand. She stood firmly now, not loudly, not defiantly, just immovable. She began making decisions without explaining them. Not out of spite, but because explanation had been used against her for too long. She understood something most people never learn. Justification invites negotiation, and negotiation invites control. So she stopped justifying. The press never published anything, not yet. The journalists stayed quiet, waiting. That silence was intentional. It let the family feel the pressure without knowing where it would land. That's how leverage matures. Meanwhile, internal changes continued. New trustees, revised reporting structures, independent reviews that couldn't be overridden with a phone call. The billionaire adapted. Of course he did. People like him always do. He shifted from dominance to diplomacy, from certainty to collaboration. On the surface, it looked like growth. It wasn't. It was survival. He tried to rebuild the narrative around reconciliation, around healing, around how families evolve. He wanted the story to end before it ever reached an audience that couldn't be controlled. She didn't oppose that. She let it sit. Because the story didn't need an ending yet. What mattered was that she now controlled the pace. One evening, she asked me what I planned to do once things stabilized. I realized I hadn't thought about it. My life had been defined for so long by proximity to this conflict that imagining a future without it felt abstract. Like trying to picture silence after standing next to machinery for years. I told her I wasn't sure. She smiled and said that uncertainty was a good sign, that it meant I wasn't being managed anymore. That was the irony of it all. In helping her reclaim autonomy, I'd lost the structure that told me who I was supposed to be. But I didn't feel lost. I felt awake. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a crossroads. People came and went with new intentions. Conversations carried different subtext. The center of gravity had shifted, and everyone was adjusting to it. Some adjusted gracefully, others didn't. And the ones who didn't were the ones I watched most closely, because control doesn't disappear when exposed. It waits. It looks for new forms. And as I stood there, no longer invisible, no longer naive, I understood something that hadn't been clear at the beginning. The billionaire's warning hadn't been about her at all. It had been about what happens when someone ordinary gets too close to an extraordinary truth. And now that I was standing on the other side of it, I knew the next chapter wouldn't be about uncovering the secret. It would be about living with what it changed. Living with it turned out to be harder than uncovering it. Once the tension stops being acute, once there's no single crisis demanding your full attention, the mind starts replaying everything. Every conversation, every decision, every moment where a different choice might have led somewhere else. That's when doubt creeps in. Not doubt about what happened, but about what it means for the rest of your life. I stayed longer than I expected. Part of it was practical. Things were still in motion. Structures were still adjusting. My presence was still useful, even if no one said it out loud. But another part of it was harder to admit. I didn't want to leave before I understood who I was without the role I'd fallen into. She was finding that out too. With control returning to her hands, she didn't rush to fill the space it left behind. She didn't throw herself into distractions or declarations. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone testing the weight of freedom before trusting it. She started making choices that had nothing to do with proving anything. Small ones, human ones. She took a class outside the estate, changed the layout of her room, ate meals at odd hours because she felt like it. None of it would have made headlines, but that was the point. Her life was finally quiet enough to belong to her. The family adjusted in public ways, charity appearances, carefully worded statements, a new emphasis on transparency that would have seemed laughable a year earlier. People praised the shift, called it progress. I watched it with a kind of detached clarity. This wasn't transformation, it was damage control. But even damage control can create space. And sometimes space is enough. I noticed something else changing too. How people treated me. At first there was caution, then curiosity, then a kind of recalibration. They didn't know where I fit anymore, and that unsettled them. I wasn't staff in the old sense, but I wasn't family. I wasn't powerless, but I didn't wield authority. I existed outside their categories. That made some people uncomfortable. It made others honest. A few came to me quietly, asked questions they couldn't ask publicly. shared observations they'd kept to themselves for years. I realized then how many people had seen fragments of the truth, but never enough to connect them. Systems like this don't survive because everyone believes the lie. They survive because no one sees the whole picture. I had seen enough now to know that leaving wouldn't undo anything. The truth didn't depend on my presence anymore. It had its own momentum. That realization was freeing. It meant I could choose what came next. I told her I was thinking of leaving. Not because I needed to escape, but because staying indefinitely felt like another kind of dependency. She understood immediately. No guilt, no surprise, just acceptance. "You helped me remember who I was," she said. "You don't need to stay to prove it." That was the cleanest goodbye we could have had, even though it wasn't immediate. We both needed time to transition out of the intensity that had bound us together. The billionaire and I spoke one last time before I left. It wasn't dramatic, no confrontation, just two people acknowledging that the dynamic between them had permanently changed. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. Instead, he said something revealing. "You were unpredictable," he told me. "That's what made you dangerous." I nodded. Unpredictability isn't rebellion. It's autonomy. When I finally stepped away from the estate, the world felt louder, messier, less controlled. It took time to adjust to that, to remember that most people don't live inside carefully managed narratives. They live in contradiction, in partial truths, in open systems. I carried what I'd learned with me, though, not the details, not the secrets, but the pattern. How power consolidates, how it protects itself, how it labels resistance as instability and compliance as care. Once you see that pattern clearly, it shows up everywhere. In corporations, in politics, in families that look nothing like billionaires on the surface. The experience rewired how I listen, how I question, how I decide when to stay quiet, and when silence becomes complicity. I didn't become cynical. I became precise. And precision is something you can't unlearn. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd listened to that warning in the beginning, if I'd stayed away, if I'd done exactly what was expected of me and nothing more. I know the answer. Things would have looked peaceful. They just wouldn't have been true. What I uncovered wasn't just a family secret. It was a reminder that truth doesn't always announce itself with evidence or outrage. Sometimes it waits quietly for the one person who isn't supposed to notice. And when that person does, the story changes direction. Not all at once, but permanently. Leaving didn't mean disconnecting. That was the part I hadn't anticipated. I thought once I stepped away, the intensity would fade, the weight would lift, and everything would settle into something resembling normal life. Instead, the story followed me in quieter ways. In how I listened to people. In how quickly I noticed power imbalances in rooms that pretended to be equal. In how often I caught myself asking one simple question beneath everything else. Who benefits if this version of reality stays intact? I took a job far from the estate. Nothing glamorous. Something intentionally ordinary. I wanted to be surrounded by people whose lives weren't curated, whose problems didn't come with legal teams attached. It helped, but it didn't erase what I'd learned. She and I stayed in touch, sparingly. Not because we were afraid, but because we respected distance. When we spoke, it wasn't about the past. It was about decisions. New ones, difficult ones, the kind that don't come with instructions. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't confronting them. It was trusting herself afterward. When someone has spent years telling you who you are, even liberation feels suspicious. You second-guess instincts. You wonder whether confidence is earned or borrowed, whether calm is real or just the absence of threat. I understood that better than I wanted to, because I was doing the same thing. I'd spent so long reacting to an external force that internal direction felt unfamiliar. I had to learn how to make choices that didn't exist in opposition to anything. Choices that stood on their own. That takes time. The story resurfaced in public months later, not explosively, but deliberately. Not headlines, but features. Context instead of accusations. Enough to reshape perception without igniting spectacle. The journalist had been patient, strategic. The kind of patience that only comes from knowing you already have what you need. The family responded the way powerful families always do. Statements crafted to sound transparent without admitting fault. A narrative of growth, of lessons learned, of moving forward. Most people accepted it. That's another thing I learned. The public doesn't demand truth, it demands resolution. And resolution is easy to manufacture. But even manufactured endings have consequences. Quiet ones, structural ones, the kind that don't make noise but change outcomes. She told me later that certain doors had closed permanently. Others had opened that she'd never been allowed near before. That trade-off didn't bother her. What matters, she said, is that no one gets to decide my limits for me anymore. I believed her, not because everything was perfect, but because her voice no longer adjusted itself to fit the room. As for me, I started speaking less about what happened and more about what it taught me. Not the specifics, the principles. How systems preserve themselves, how narratives are enforced, how dissent is often framed as dysfunction. People listened, some because they were curious, others because they recognized pieces of their own lives in what I described. That was unexpected. I realized then that the story had never been just about one family, or one girl, or one warning. It was about proximity, about what happens when someone ordinary gets close enough to power to see the seams holding it together. Most people never get that close, and those who do are usually absorbed, rewarded, or silenced. I hadn't been any of those. I'd slipped through. That realization came with its own responsibility, not to expose everything, not to crusade, but to remain alert. Because once you know how easily truth can be shaped, you can't unknow it. You start asking better questions. You stop accepting convenient answers. You notice when complexity is reduced to something neat and marketable. And you understand that whenever someone says, "stay away," what they often mean is, "don't look too closely." I still think about that warning, not with resentment, with clarity. Because it marked the moment my life divided into two parts, before I understood how power hides, and after I learned how quietly it panics when someone stops playing their role. What comes next isn't dramatic. It's slower than that. It's a series of choices made without applause, without certainty, without guarantees. Choices informed by the understanding that truth doesn't need to be loud to be disruptive. It just needs to be seen. After that, life settled into something that looked ordinary from the outside. I woke up early. I worked. I paid attention to small things again. Coffee tasted stronger. Conversations felt less performative. I was no longer anticipating the next move from someone with more power than me, and yet I never fully relaxed. Not because I was afraid, but because awareness doesn't switch off just because the threat is gone. That awareness became a lens. I noticed how often people confuse authority with truth, how confidently narratives are repeated simply because they come from the right mouth, how quickly discomfort is labeled as dysfunction when it challenges a structure that benefits from staying intact. Once you see that pattern, you start recognizing it everywhere. At work, I saw it in meetings where the quietest person had the clearest insight, but was ignored because they didn't speak with confidence. In relationships, I saw it in dynamics where one person's emotions were treated as reality and the other's as inconvenience. In institutions, I saw it in policies framed as protection that somehow always limited the same group of people. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. She once told me that the hardest lies to dismantle aren't the obvious ones. They're the ones that sound reasonable, the ones that come with explanations, the ones that wrap control in concern and call it responsibility. That stuck with me. We spoke less often as time went on, not because of distance, but because we no longer needed the same kind of connection. Our conversations became lighter, shorter, focused on present decisions instead of past battles. That was a good sign. It meant the story was no longer running our lives. But every now and then, something would pull me back into reflection. A headline. A conversation overheard on the train. A story about someone dismissed as unstable until the truth came out too late. Those moments reminded me that what happened wasn't rare. It was just hidden better in some places than others. I started writing things down again, but differently this time. Not timelines or evidence, observations, patterns, questions that didn't have easy answers. I wasn't building a case, I was building understanding. And understanding has a way of changing how you move through the world. I became slower to judge, faster to listen, less impressed by certainty, more curious about silence. I stopped assuming that calm environments were healthy and started asking what it took to maintain that calm. Sometimes the answer was care. Other times, it was suppression. You can tell the difference if you're willing to look long enough. The billionaire crossed my mind occasionally, not as a villain, but as a symbol. A reminder that power doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Often, it presents itself as order, as stability, as knowing what's best. And that's why it's so effective. Because people don't resist what feels organized. They resist what feels chaotic. She had been labeled chaotic. All she'd really been was inconvenient. I wondered sometimes whether he ever regretted that warning. Whether he understood that by drawing attention to her, he'd activated the very curiosity he'd spent years suppressing. Or whether, in his mind, everything that followed was just an unfortunate anomaly. People like that rarely reframe themselves as wrong. They reframe the world as unpredictable. That thought didn't anger me. It clarified something. The goal was never to change people like him. It was to make their control less absolute. And that had happened. Quietly. Imperfectly, but permanently. I didn't know where my path would lead next. I only knew it wouldn't involve playing a role written by someone else. I had seen what happens when narratives go unchallenged. I had seen how much damage can be done in the name of order. And I had seen how much can change when one person refuses to look away. That knowledge stayed with me, not as a burden, but as a compass, pointing not toward conflict, but toward clarity. Clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It shows up in the moments where you pause instead of reacting. In the questions you don't ask out loud because you already know why the answer will be shaped a certain way. In the way you stop seeking approval from structures that only reward compliance. I began to notice how often people negotiate against themselves without realizing it. How quickly they shrink their own boundaries to fit expectations that were never neutral to begin with. I'd done that too, before everything happened. I just hadn't had the language for it. Now I did. And once you have language, you start hearing it everywhere. I heard it in corporate mission statements that promised empowerment while tracking every minute of productivity. I heard it in wellness initiatives that treated burnout as an individual failure instead of a structural one. I heard it in families that spoke about love but practiced control. The pattern was always the same. Authority framed as care. Obedience framed as maturity. Resistance framed as instability. She had been caught in that pattern long before I entered the picture. I just stumbled into the space where it became visible. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't been there. If the secret would have stayed buried longer, if someone else would have noticed, or if the narrative would have hardened until it was impossible to challenge. Those thoughts never lasted long, because they assumed the outcome was inevitable. And I'd learned that nothing is inevitable when perception changes. I ran into an old colleague from the estate months later, someone who'd kept their distance during everything, someone neutral enough to survive the transition. They asked me how she was doing. I said she was building a life that didn't need permission. They nodded slowly, like that sentence explained more than I'd intended. She always seemed sharper than people gave her credit for, they said. That comment stayed with me, because it wasn't new. It was just late. Most truths aren't hidden. They're delayed. I started paying attention to delays after that. Who benefits from postponement, from endless reviews, from waiting until the moment has passed and urgency has evaporated? Delay is one of the cleanest tools of control because it doesn't look aggressive, it looks reasonable. Give it time. Let's revisit this. Now isn't the right moment. I'd heard all of that before, so when people said it to me in my new life, I listened differently. I asked what would change with time. I asked who decided when the moment was right. I asked what waiting actually protected. Those questions made rooms uncomfortable, not hostile, just unsettled. And unsettled rooms are where real conversations start. She once told me that stability had been used as a weapon against her, that the threat wasn't chaos, but being labeled the source of it, that as long as she carried that label, nothing she said could land cleanly. I saw that label being applied to others all the time now. Employees who asked too many questions, students who challenged outdated frameworks, family members who refused to absorb blame they hadn't earned. The language changed. The tactic didn't. What surprised me most was how often people recognized the pattern once it was named, like they'd been waiting for someone to articulate something they'd felt but couldn't organize. That's when I understood why the warning had been so specific. Stay away from her. Not stay away from the truth, not stay away from the situation. Her. Because she was the anchor, the living contradiction to the story they needed to maintain. As long as she existed outside their control, the narrative remained vulnerable. And I had been warned away from proximity, not because proximity was dangerous to me, but because it was dangerous to them. That inversion changed how I interpreted everything that followed. It reframed the fear. It wasn't fear of exposure. It was fear of connection. Connection collapses hierarchies. It makes comparison possible. It removes isolation, which is the foundation of manipulation. Once she was no longer isolated, the system lost its leverage. That insight followed me everywhere. I stopped underestimating how powerful simple alignment can be. Not organizing, not rebelling, just seeing clearly together. That's what made the difference. Not confrontation, not force, recognition. I didn't become an activist. I didn't position myself as someone with answers. I became someone who noticed patterns and refused to pretend they were accidents. That refusal is quieter than outrage, but it lasts longer. Every so often I'd get updates about the family. Shifts in leadership, restructuring, quiet exits. Nothing that suggested collapse, but plenty that suggested recalibration. Power adapts. It always does. But adaptation isn't the same as immunity. The system had learned something it couldn't unlearn, that people were watching, that silence wasn't guaranteed, that proximity creates risk, and risk changes behavior. I carried that understanding with me as I moved forward, not as a weapon, but as a filter. I stopped asking whether something was allowed and started asking whether it was aligned. I stopped mistaking access for influence. I stopped assuming that order meant health. Those shifts weren't dramatic. They were internal. But internal shifts change trajectories. And as my life continued to unfold, shaped now by choices that belonged to me, I understood something fundamental. The warning had been real, not because she was dangerous, but because getting close to the truth rewires you. It doesn't let you go back to the version of yourself who didn't notice. And once that happens, the story keeps moving, whether you're ready for it or not. And once it is, nothing ever fits the same way again. There's a quiet loneliness that comes with that kind of rewiring. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of seeing things other people aren't ready to see yet. You stop participating in certain conversations the same way. Jokes land differently. Assumptions feel heavier. You realize how much social life depends on everyone agreeing not to look too closely. I didn't judge people for that. I understood it. Most people aren't lying when they accept a simple story. They're conserving energy. Questioning everything is exhausting, and not everyone has the luxury to do it. I'd been forced into that position by circumstance, not virtue. That kept me grounded. Still, there were moments when I missed the simplicity of before. When my biggest concern was whether I was doing my job well enough, not whether the system around me was quietly shaping outcomes I'd never consented to. But you can't unknow what you know. And pretending you don't see something is a different kind of lie. I started noticing how often people ask for permission without realizing it. Permission to speak, permission to disagree, permission to leave situations that no longer fit them. They wait for signals from authority figures, from social norms, from invisible rules that were never written down. I'd waited like that too. Until I didn't. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. A series of small refusals to minimize my own perception, to dismiss discomfort as overreaction, to accept explanations that relied on me doubting myself. That's another thing power does well. It teaches you to mistrust your own clarity. She'd lived under that influence for years. I'd only tasted it briefly, but the mechanism was the same. Repetition, authority, isolation. Over time, the narrative sinks in, not because it's convincing, but because it's constant. Breaking out of that requires something deceptively simple. Validation, not praise, not agreement, recognition. Someone saying, "I see what you're seeing." That's what had changed everything for her. And in a quieter way, it changed things for me too. I became more deliberate about who I listened to, less impressed by titles, more interested in coherence. I noticed who could explain their reasoning without leaning on status, and who needed their position to do the talking for them. The difference was obvious once I started looking for it. Months passed, life kept moving, new routines replaced old ones. The intensity faded into something like perspective. But every now and then, a memory would surface uninvited. A look on someone's face, a phrase repeated too often, a door that was always locked for reasons that never quite made sense. Those memories didn't haunt me. They calibrated me. They reminded me that systems rarely announce their rules. You learn them by watching who gets corrected, who gets protected, and who gets quietly removed. I saw that play out again and again in smaller settings. Offices, friend groups, communities. Always the same dynamic. Always the same language. This is for your own good. You're overthinking it. Let's not make this a big deal. Each phrase carrying the same implication. Stop looking. I no longer stopped. Not loudly, not confrontationally. I just didn't absorb the message. She told me once that the strangest part of her new life was how little she needed to explain herself. How freeing it was to make a decision and let it stand without defending it against imaginary objections. I knew exactly what she meant. Explanation had been a survival tool before, a way to preempt criticism, to soften resistance, to appear reasonable in a system that punished certainty from the wrong people. Now, explanation was optional. That didn't make life easier. It made it cleaner. And clean lines are easier to follow. Sometimes people would ask me why I seemed calmer than before, why I didn't get pulled into conflicts or debates the same way, why I listened more than I argued. I never told them the full story. I just said I'd learned that most battles aren't about being right. They're about who gets to define reality. And I was no longer interested in fighting on someone else's terms. The family faded further into the background as time went on. Not gone. Just less central, like a chapter you don't reread but still reference unconsciously. Their world continued, adjusted to new constraints. Hers expanded beyond it. That mattered, because it proved something important. Exposure isn't the only form of accountability. Sometimes the real shift happens when control loses exclusivity, when influence spreads just enough that no single narrative can dominate completely. That's harder to measure, but it's more durable. I don't know if the billionaire ever fully understood what changed, or if he simply adapted to the new conditions without naming them. People like him don't often reflect in ways that threaten their self-concept. They move forward. So did I. But I moved forward with a different internal compass, one that didn't point toward approval or access, but toward alignment. Toward situations where curiosity wasn't punished and silence wasn't enforced. Those places exist. They're just quieter. And as I kept choosing them, one after another, I realized something that would have sounded naive before all of this happened. You don't dismantle power by confronting it head-on. You dismantle it by refusing to organize your life around its expectations. That refusal doesn't look heroic. It looks ordinary. And that's what makes it effective. Because ordinary choices, made consistently, reshape what's possible over time. And once that process starts, it doesn't really stop. It just keeps unfolding, decision by decision, in directions you couldn't have predicted at the beginning. Especially not the moment someone looked you in the eye and told you to stay away. Staying away would have been easier. That's the part people don't like to admit. Compliance usually is. It asks very little of you in the short term. You keep your job, your place, your sense of order. You don't have to explain yourself or sit with uncertainty. You don't have to recalibrate your identity. You just keep moving inside the lines that were already drawn. I understood why most people choose that path. I didn't see it as weakness anymore. I saw it as adaptation. When systems reward silence and punish deviation, silence becomes a skill. And skills get passed down, normalized, even praised. That realization softened something in me. I stopped expecting courage from everyone. I started respecting awareness instead. Awareness is quieter than bravery. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in pauses, in careful listening, in moments where someone chooses not to repeat a narrative even if they don't openly challenge it. Those moments mattered more than I'd realized at first. They were the cracks. I began noticing who paused before agreeing, who asked follow-up questions instead of nodding, who waited before labeling someone difficult or unstable or problematic. Those people rarely led meetings, but they influenced outcomes. She had become one of them. Not visible in the way power usually is, but present in rooms where decisions quietly change direction. She didn't need to dominate conversations anymore. Her credibility did that for her. People leaned in when she spoke now, not because of fear or novelty, but because she was precise. Precision commands respect in ways volume never can. We talked once about how strange it felt to be listened to without having to earn it through suffering. How unsettling it was to realize that being dismissed before hadn't been about her clarity, but about others' incentives. That's another thing power distorts. It convinces you that your worth is conditional. Once that illusion breaks, rebuilding yourself takes patience. You have to learn to trust reactions that aren't defensive, to speak without bracing for impact, to exist without constantly scanning for consequences. She was learning that. So was I. I found myself drawn to environments where questions weren't treated as threats, where disagreement didn't immediately trigger hierarchy, where people could say, "I don't know," without losing status. Those spaces felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious. Because when you've lived inside control structures, openness can feel like chaos. You expect traps. You wait for the hidden rule. You assume the cost will reveal itself later. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The difference was discernment. I became more comfortable leaving places that relied on unspoken compliance. More comfortable walking away without explanation. That would have terrified me before. Now it felt like alignment. Not everything needs closure. Some things just need distance. Every so often, someone would ask me if I regretted getting involved. If life would have been simpler if I'd followed the warning and stayed away. I always paused before answering, not because I doubted the choice, but because the question assumed simplicity was the goal. I didn't regret it, but I also didn't romanticize it. What happened wasn't a triumph, it was a shift. And shifts come with loss as well as clarity. I lost innocence. I lost certain illusions about fairness and intention. I lost the comfort of believing that authority generally knows what it's doing. But I gained something more durable. I gained orientation. I learned how to locate myself inside systems without disappearing into them. How to observe power without craving it. How to engage without surrendering authorship. Those skills don't show up on resumes, but they shape lives. I noticed how often people confuse stability with safety. How many environments feel calm because dissent has been trained out of them. How much energy it takes to maintain appearances when truth is inconvenient. She once described the family's old dynamic as a house with immaculate walls and no windows. Beautiful from the outside, suffocating inside. Now, there were windows. Not wide open, not without risk, but enough to let air in. That was the difference. And that difference mattered far beyond that one estate. Because it proved something I hadn't believed before. That you don't need to tear structures down to weaken their grip. Sometimes you just need to introduce visibility. Light doesn't destroy everything it touches, but it changes how people behave. And once behavior changes, outcomes follow. I carried that understanding forward, not as a mission, but as a posture. A way of standing in the world that didn't require confrontation to be effective. I stopped trying to be persuasive. I focused on being clear. Clarity travels farther than argument ever will. It invites reflection instead of resistance. And reflection is dangerous to systems that rely on unquestioned repetition. That's what the warning had been trying to prevent. Not chaos, not scandal, but reflection. Because reflection creates choice, and choice is the one thing control can never fully survive. So I kept choosing. Quietly, deliberately, without asking whether it was allowed. And with each choice, the distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming grew wider. Not in a dramatic way, in a way that felt irreversible, like stepping into a current that doesn't rush you forward, but also doesn't let you drift back. That current carried me into places I hadn't planned for, not physically, but internally. into questions I'd never asked myself before everything happened, about ambition, about belonging, about what it actually means to succeed in a system that rewards certain behaviors and quietly penalizes others. Before, I thought success was proximity, access, being close enough to power that some of it might rub off on you. I'd seen that model growing up, watching my father navigate other people's authority with precision and restraint. He survived by being useful and invisible at the same time. I respected that. I still do. But I no longer wanted it for myself. What I wanted was coherence. A life where my actions didn't require constant translation, where I didn't have to compartmentalize my values to function. That realization didn't come with a clear roadmap. It came with a series of rejections, of paths I chose not to take, even when they were offered. Some of those offers came wrapped in flattery, others in urgency, a few in warnings disguised as advice. I recognize the pattern now. When something feels rushed, it's usually because it benefits someone else more than it benefits you. I learned to slow things down. That frustrated